We done with the 90s. I'm sure most of you guys already know what it is, but for those of you who don't, the younger generation of fans, or in other words the Gen Z, are claiming that the 90s and to that extent even the 80s are vastly overrated, that the players of those eras were not nearly as good as they are today, that the league and its product back then was not actually as great as people remember them to be, and that those decades and their place in NBA history is vastly over-exaggerated because of the nostalgia that people have for the era that they grew up in. Or as the younger generations like to call them, the old heads. Now, some of that flack is well warranted because older fans love to insult and critique new NBA players, the modern NBA age, and the league as it stands today. But some of the younger fans are going overboard with it by calling older generation players plumbers and firemen.
You know, he was being guarded by plumbers and firemen.
So I want to take a look at the data to see if there is any truth to these claims. Are the players today better than the players of past generations in every aspect of the game? Is the league and the game today better than what it was back then? And is the Gen Z right to take over? Or are the old heads right to impart some wisdom to them? But literally all the NBA fans, new and old alike, will agree on one thing. Scoring has tremendously increased over the years. Back in the old days, teams used to put up 70 to 80 points a game, and now they routinely surpass 130. Back in the 90s, a player dropping 40 points in a night was considered to be a huge accomplishment as a scorer. And in today's day and age, you aren't really even considered a good scorer unless you have a couple of 50 pieces under your belt. And the data absolutely backs up what we see with our very own eyes. Scoring has increased tremendously over the last 3 decades. But why is that? Michael Jordan was considered the greatest basketball player ever right after his first three-peat when he retired at the end of the 1993 season for the first time. This is when Michael Jordan's second three-peat happened. By then, a lot of the younger rookies entering the league in the 90s were trying to emulate Jordan's gameplay, and as such were taking fewer shots at the rim and more mid-range jumpers and fadeaway jump shots. Because those shots happened to be less efficient than the ones taken right at the rim, field goal percentages league-wide dropped, and so did the scoring. The league began to take notice and started implementing a series of rule changes to spur offensive production, with the first one coming at the end of the 2000 season, revolving around backcourt violations and shot clock resets in order to make the game seemingly faster. This alleviated scoring a little bit up until the span from 2002 to 2004 when the league introduced the biggest change in this category yet. They introduced the defensive 3-second violation, essentially leaving lanes wide open for drives to the basket, and disallowed hand checking. This was huge for the offense, and it completely flipped the script as far as scoring is concerned. From there on out, the league decided to double down on its rule changes to spur offensive production, bringing us all the way down to 2019, which brought the Freedom of Movement Act, essentially banning hand checking even on off-ball offensive players. And from there on out, scoring literally took off. These rule changes, coupled with the fact that over the last 5 years, refs are increasingly turning a blind eye to even the most egregious of travels and carries, and being extremely trigger happy to call fouls, it's really no surprise to note that the entire scoring increase over the last 3 decades can be tracked back down to the last 5 years alone. But at what cost? If we look at the other side of the ball, or the defensive side, which happens to be just as important as the offense, and analyze the total number of steals plus blocks that teams averaged on a per game basis, or in other words, the stocks per game, we notice a strong trend, a very strong declining trend, showing that the total number of stocks per game have sharply dropped over the last 3 decades. And the declines can again be traced down to the same rule changes which were implemented by the league to spur the offense. Basically, the rules that were created to spur offensive production are hindering the league on its defensive intensity, and as such, the players today are better offensively than their counterparts from previous generations because the rules allow them to be. But at the same time, those same rules are hindering their development on the defensive side of things, and as such, players of past generations were far better defenders than what we see in the players today. So if players today are better offensively and players of past generations were better defensively, which era had the better overall basketball player? Well, unless an all-decade team from the modern era faces off in a 7-game series against an all-decade team from the 80s and 90s, we will never really know the answer to that question. But when it comes to comparing these two generations, I will say this. It seems like players in the past simply wanted it more. They were more determined to beat their opponents. They had a stronger will to win the game. And they were willing to do whatever it took to make sure that their team got the W. What makes me say that? Rebounding. This is an aspect of the game which has not been directly influenced or affected by the rule changes that have been introduced over the years to spur offensive production. When it comes to rebounding, teams and players are both expected to get their own defensive boards. But when it comes to crashing the offensive glass, that's where mentality comes into play. That's where you can see a player's mindset. That's where you can measure the intangibles. How badly do you want that victory? Are you willing to put your body on the line going crashing against your opponents to secure the ball? Are you willing to go deep inside enemy territory so that your team can have a second chance at goal? Over the last 3 decades, teams have gone from putting up 14 offensive rebounds a game all the way down to averaging 10 in present-day NBA. That's over a 30% drop in offensive rebounding. Now, you might be thinking, well, players today are just better at making their shots. And if they're making more of their shots, there are fewer rebounds to go around, right? But in that situation, why have the number of defensive rebounds increased significantly over the same time span, whereas the total number of rebounds has roughly remained the same? This to me shows that players in the past did not just put up a shot and start tracking back on defense. They were never caught ball watching. And more often than in today's NBA, players of the past raced to the baskets to get their own offensive boards in case their shot missed. Which to me shows a lot of versatility and shows a lot of grit and toughness, which to some extent is a little lacking in today's day and age. But enough about the players. Maybe instead of trying to figure out which era had the better players, the right question to ask is perhaps which era was simply more fun to watch. Ultimately, basketball and the NBA, for a matter of fact, is a sport and provides entertainment and means nothing without the fans. So what do the fans think of this? Are the fans in general really done with the 90s? If that's the case, then viewership today should be much more than what it has ever been in the sport, right? But sadly, that's not the case. If we look at the NBA viewership, as well as the NBA TV ratings in the finals over the last 3 decades, we see a strong declining trend. You see this huge spike here in 1998? That's Michael Jordan's last championship with the Chicago Bulls. That's the last time he ever wore the red, white and black. And till this day, it remains the most watched finals in league history. After he retired permanently from the Bulls, the viewership and the ratings took a massive dip up until the 15, 16, 17 seasons with the Warriors-Cavs rivalries fueling the viewership a little bit. And then in 2020 came the least watched finals in league history, which to me says a lot. This was during quarantine. This was during the pandemic. People had nothing else to do while sitting at home, and yet they wouldn't turn into the finals. In fact, both viewership as well as TV ratings have nearly halved over the last 3 decades, which suggests a pretty big concern for the NBA as a league. And I think I know why the NBA viewership has suffered so much over the last 3 decades, especially in recent years. Suppose I gave you 2 games, both of them happening between the Golden State Warriors and the LA Lakers. The first one is a score of 98-69 at the end of the 3rd quarter, and the second one is a much closer affair, being a 2-point game with the lead having changed 15 times over the first 3 quarters. Which game and which 4th quarter are you more likely to tune into? Obviously the second one, right? Because it's a closer game. We as fans don't like blowouts. We as fans don't like it when the games are not competitive. If we define a blowout by a final margin of victory of 20 points or more and evaluate it over the last 3 decades, we see a strong trend here too. In the 1990s, there was about a 13 to 15% chance that a game ended in a blowout, meaning 1 out of every 7 to 8 games. It attained its lowest point in the 2007 season where 1 out of every 8 games was a blowout. And the last 5 years, that number has jumped from 14% to 18%, meaning that nearly 1 out of every 5 games is a blowout margin of victory of 20 points or more in today's NBA. We all know the importance of shooting the ball. Outside of layups and dunks, that's the only way you can make a basket, which is one of the 2 most important things in the game of basketball. The other obviously being preventing the other team from doing the same, or in other words, defense. If I'm watching my favorite team play and they're putting up brick after brick after brick, clanking off the rim, I know I get incredibly frustrated because the chances are they're going to lose that game. But what about being blown out of the water by the other team? If we look at the chances of getting blown out when a team is shooting 10% worse than their opponents in a game, That number has gone up a lot over the years. Back in the 90s, it used to be within 35 to 40%, basically about 1 out of every 3 games where your favorite team was having an awful shooting night, it would result in a 20-point or more blowout. And that number has gone all the way up to 50% now. So if on any given night, your team decides to build a house of bricks, you can essentially just flip a coin to see if they're going to be blown out of the building. Now, obviously that's because of the evolution of the game, but that evolution has been brought about because of the rule changes that have been put into effect to promote scoring, and it's reached the point where shooting efficiency from the field is the single most important factor in deciding wins and losses. But no topic on shooting is really complete without addressing the 3-point line. What happens when your team is having a really rough night shooting the 3 ball? Have they just automatically lost? What are their chances of pulling out the victory? Well, over the last 30 years, if a team is shooting 10% worse than their opponent from the 3-point line, the chances of winning the game have declined significantly. In this aspect, we can just disregard the 90s era because low shot attempts and those shots were considered to be cop-outs or desperation attempts put up late in the shot clock or to beat the buzzer. The early 2000s were a good balanced era when it came to 3-point shooting because even if you were having an off night, you could still come out with the victory. But ever since then, the chances of winning while having a rough 3-point shooting night has declined significantly to the point where in today's NBA, if your team is bricking the 3 ball, they're gonna lose about 7 out of 8 games. And no team in the modern era is a better representation of the 3-point centric style of gameplay than the Boston Celtics, where each and every member of their unit is required to have a good 3-point shot, whereas the Denver Nuggets are an exception to that rule in modern day NBA. They are more similarly constructed to the teams as they were constructed in the 80s and 90s, in a balanced way, having sufficient scoring, shooting, defending, rebounding, and a team that actually plays as a cohesive unit with excellent coaching. This is why the Boston Celtics do not have nearly as much playoff success as the Denver Nuggets. Because every now and then, there will be a night when their shots stop falling, when it gets really quiet. And when that happens, they will eventually lose the game. Because their whole style of play revolves around outshooting their opponent from the 3-point line. Whereas the Denver Nuggets in the same situation will pull through with the victory by impacting the game in a plethora of different ways, as we saw in the Game 2 of the first round Western Conference matchup with the LA Lakers. Now, would you have a league where most of the teams are like the Denver Nuggets? Or a league where most of the teams are like the Boston Celtics? This is why you see so many blowouts in today's day and age as compared to previous generations. Because most teams are constructed like the Boston Celtics that live and die by the 3-point shot, which happens to be extremely volatile. Whereas in the past generations, teams as well as players were able to impact the game in a multitude of different ways, including defense, hustle, and rebounding. And as such, even if the shots were not falling, the games remained to be competitive, which is why statistically the viewership was higher. It's not because the players were better or worse back then. It's not even because the talent or the skill level was higher or lower back then. It all again ties back down to the same rules and officiating. In today's day and age, when the rules solely focus on offense, you end up with games that essentially look like a shoot-around, where the team whose shots are falling that night is going to win the game. If you overcorrect and focus only on defense, then you'll end up basically with the era of the 70s, where teams are eager to load up on big, tall, and strong players, and on any given night, the bigger team is going to win the game. This is why the 90s are considered the golden era of basketball. This is why fans have such a high appreciation for that era. And this is why statistically, it's the most watched era in basketball history. It's because the rules and officiating were even. They equally favored both sides of the ball. And as such, if a team or a player's performance was not good in one skill set, they could still impact the game and affect the final score. As a part of this generation, I would love to be able to say that the league right now is the best that it has ever been. But can you really make that claim? In order to get the game to its highest level, we have to acknowledge what the past generations simply did better. So as it turns out, we're not done with the 90s. Maybe the 90s offered the perfect blueprint for what the league and its officiating should look like, so that the game can be what it can be. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you during next time's upload. God bless you all.